Today on this show, I'm so inspired by this fascinating interview with writer and scholar Dr. Jennifer Orme. She specializes in fairy tales and wonder stories. We look at what makes fairy tales so enduring, the power of disruptive story middles, and how imagination leads to hope and justice. Be sure to stick around to the end for Jennifer's most wonderful writing prompt. I'm Susanna Alyssa Andrew, and this is Stardust and Courage, the podcast where we use writing, curiosity, and imagination to see beyond challenges and make life more meaningful. It's mindful writing to go deeper, grow, and imagine, and I'm so very glad you're here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hello, Jennifer Orme, and welcome to Stardust and Courage. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Suzanne. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
I'm so excited to chat with you too. I was just so delighted to find out that you're the co-editor of two amazing books about wonder and fairy tales. It just makes me so happy to know that.
It made me really happy to create them and work with my co-editors to come up with some really amazing stuff.
So which one did you publish first?
The first one is called Inviting Interruptions, Wonder Tales in the 21st Century. And I co-edited that with Christina Bakilega, who is a wonderful scholar based out of, mostly from Hawaii. And that one is an anthology of previously published textual stories, so a lot of stories, but also we included a lot of visual art as well. So photographs, paintings, sculptures. Obviously, it's in a book form, so there are photographs of those paintings and sculptures and things, as well as comics and texts around wonder and fairy tales. And that one came out, I think, in 2001, and we're really, really proud of that. I'm really glad that we were able to include, and our publisher, Wayne State University Press, was really positive and helpful in creating color images so that it's a really vibrant book in a lot of ways, both what it's saying and what it looks like.
Amazing. And when did the second one come out?
The second one came out just this year, 2024, and that one's called Just Wonder, Shifting Perspectives in Tradition, and I co-edited that with Pauline Greenhill, another scholar at the University of Winnipeg, and that is a collection of new scholarly essays that talk about the engagement between justice and wonder, so our concepts of what is justice or what is injustice as well, and how those align with, are confronted by, or can be played with ideas of wonder. And so we have a large number of different scholars from various different disciplines, from criminology, literary studies, Indigenous studies, all kinds of different people engaging with those two concepts of wonder and justice. And that's, it's a challenging book, and I'm really glad that it's out there for people to check out and use to think with, I think.
Okay, awesome. Maybe you could tell me what has sustained your interest in fairy tales and folklore well into adulthood?
It's kind of funny. I've been thinking about it, and I realized I don't think I was super keen on fairy tales as a child. I think we think of fairy tales as a children's form of literature, and it's all fairies and princesses and castles and getting married and bibbidi-bobbidi-boo. And fairy tales were certainly part of my childhood literature, and it was something that was around, and I definitely loved the magic of them, but they weren't sort of central to my understanding of what I loved in story. What I really loved in story was what I've come to think of later as really wonder, all of the magic, the ways of looking at the world in awe and surprise and curiosity. So I was also, from a young child, really interested in all the spooky stuff, really ghost stories and scary stories and, like what's that under the bed, monster stories and things like that. And that came with me through into my teens when I really got into, the Gothic and loved the Gothic stories and the vampires and the Anne Rice and, going to the clubs and stuff. But then by the time I got to university, I went into creative writing and literature studies. And at one point, I took a course in literary theory. And we were introduced early on in that course to a book called The Morphology of the Folktale by Vladimir Prop. And that's a book that was written in the 1920s by a Russian scholar who took a corpus of fairy tales, it was 150 or 250 fairy tales, and broke them down into 7 dramatis personae. So not exactly characters, but character types that will show up in every fairy tale or every folk tale that he studied, and 31 functions, what he calls functions. And these are sort of the events or points that will happen. Not all 31 will show up in every single text, but they will always show up in the same order. This sounds really geeky and kind of weird, and some people will find it boring, but I thought it was fascinating that there were people studying how stories worked and the different individual parts that went into stories. And then they would talk about this stuff, and that they would often use fairy tales as their exemplary texts because fairy tales are short. We tend to be very familiar with them. Audiences do, so you don't have to sort of give a long plot summary of a book just to produce your theory and show people about your theory. And so I was really interested in that and the idea that you could study narrative and how narrative works. And at the same time, I was being introduced to more and more female authors and writers. And in the way that that happens when you become interested in something, all of a sudden you start hearing about it and seeing it everywhere. So I started to become interested in fairy tales again. And all of a sudden, everywhere I looked, all the female writers that I loved were interacting with fairy tales or retelling fairy tales or taking fairy tale characters and putting them into their books. And I just thought, this is amazing. These things are everywhere. So I sort of followed that thread in my own research and interests. And eventually I found a book called Postmodern Fairy Tales by Christina Bakulega. And I found that and thought, yeah, this is what I want to do. This has got feminism. It's got narrative theory. It's got fairy tales. It's got humor. I love this. I want to work with this person. And so I did. I went off to Hawaii and did graduate school with Christina. And since then, she's my mentor and my friend and now my co-editor of Inviting Interruptions. And that's where it all sort of came through and sort of has led to.
Wow, that's such an amazing, beautiful path. Maybe you can make a little bit of a distinction. What's the difference between wonder tales and fairy tales?
How do we differentiate? Fairy tales, I would say, and others may argue with me, but I think fairy tales are a particular genre that are rooted in a sort of Euro-American tradition, that fairy tales are always fictional tales that engage magic and wonder. We often think of fairy tales as being very transformative or about transformation. In the folkloric tradition, because many fairy tales come from a folkloric tradition, so they don't have single authors. They are sort of out there in the ether, and everybody owns fairy tales. We might think of it that way, so that anyone can tell their Snow White story. Anyone can tell their Sleeping Beauty story. When I say those titles, everyone knows what I'm talking about. These are all from sort of Euro-American tradition and Euro-American traditions of collection of stories from the oral traditions, of editing, of publishing, of deciding what is important and what is not important, which stories get told over and over again in publishing and which ones do not, which ones end up as, Disney films and which ones do not. But it's a relatively, comparatively narrow understanding of a particular kind of wonder tale. A wonder tale, I would argue, has sort of a wider reach. And what that does is it allows us to think about tales from other cultures, from other spaces with different kinds of functions that aren't necessarily primarily fictional stories or primarily made for entertainment, but maybe made for education or for acculturation in different cultures. That it would actually be, replaying sort of colonialist ideologies to say, oh, that's the Chinese Cinderella, when that story may or may not have had the same purpose that the story of Cinderella that we know have. What we do when we say, oh, that is the indigenous, Little Red Riding Hood, or that is the whatever, the other. This is really a colonial kind of way of approaching stories and taking them out of their original context and placing different values on them, often infantilizing them because we think of fairy tales as children's literature rather than as stories for adults or to be shared by communities more widely. But that's one of the things, that's one of the more political aspects of the difference between wonder and fairy tales. But wonder tales also can encompass a lot from other genres. So we can bring in the idea of horror. We can bring in ideas from other kinds of genres that also cause awe, that feeling of wonder, that amazement that isn't necessarily fairy godmothers and talking animals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Maybe now you can tell us a little bit more about that sense of awe and wonder and what that means to you and what draws you into that sense of wonder.
I think for me, wonder is really, it's at the center of a meaningful life. Being able to feel awe or surprise, but also wonder is also an action, right? So it may be a feeling, a vibe that one gets, that one sees something and one goes, oh, wow, that's amazing, right? That kind of wonder. But it's also curiosity. It's also questioning. It's also how we approach the world outside of us. And rather than just passively taking things in, it really has to do with engaging with our world, with openness, the ability to ask questions, the ability to look at things from multiple perspectives. And when you can do that, you also build up empathy. So when you build up empathy, you're able to see the world from other people's perspectives. And if you're able to see the world from other people's perspectives, you move further away from me tooism and to a more collective understanding of, wow, we're all living in the world together. Maybe we should be working together to make it a better place rather than just thinking me, me, me. Those are two of the things that sort of come out of wonder. We can extrapolate into the future possibilities, as well as look into the past, maybe in different ways, which we see if we're thinking about maybe some science fiction or alternative histories that make us look at our relationships over time differently. We might think about the ways that wonder is experienced internally, but it's about things that are outside of us, right? And really, I find even when it's scary, even when it's difficult, even when we're asking questions that are uncomfortable, ultimately, I almost always find wonder joyful. And I think there's always, because it's in a spirit of curiosity, of seeking knowledge, of trying to learn about something new, that is almost always going to be a positive, although it isn't always. Does that make sense?
Total sense. And I love that sense of engagement with the imagination and the sense of joy that comes with it. One thing that I found completely remarkable in reading your work is the intersection between imagination and justice. That's something I've never really connected in my brain before. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more for our audience.
Well, I think any artistic endeavors, any scientific endeavors, scholarly endeavors, anytime we're making something new, we're using our imagination. We start off thinking and wondering about it. There's that sort of simple way of looking at it that we often don't think, right? That, oh, right, we always start with imagination. We always start with what ifs. And that means that we can question the status quo. If we're looking at the world around us and saying, I'm not really comfortable with the way certain things are going, one way or the other, the reason we're not comfortable with those things, or the way we're able to recognize a discomfort with the status quo, is our ability to wonder and to question it. And once we have the ability to wonder or question, we can also start to imagine differently. We can start to imagine, hey, what if there's another way for things to be? And often that will start with artists, with writers, and taking those imaginings and putting them out there in outer space, or putting them way back in the past of the once upon a time land that doesn't really exist. But if we put it there, it's a safe place to ask questions and to challenge things in new ways. At the same time, the kinds of imaginations we have, the stories we tell, both reflect our world, but also reflect the worlds that we want to have. And if we are people who would rather live in a world where certain people are presumed to be better than others, we tell stories that create characters where one character is innately, I put in air quotes, better than another kind of person. That's another way that wonder and imagination isn't benign at all times, right? It's something one puts to work, and it can be put to work to be oppressive as well as liberatory. I don't know, did that answer your question? Or did
Yeah, that's really, really good. Yeah. I think you touched on the question of what if. And when I think about that a little bit more, I think that what if is probably one of the best writing prompts in the whole world. Because it's a real trigger for the imagination and curiosity. I'm sure a lot of stories have begun with the simple question, what if?
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. That's always where, that's usually where I start, right? Or what if, or how did this happen? And either you go digging into your research or you start imagining, how did we get to this place? Or how did this thing come to be?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I'm fascinated by is what makes fairy tales and folkloric tales so enduring.
I'm usually not a person to make, grand statements. I put in my little qualifier there. I'm usually not a person to make grand statements or say from the beginning of time, blah, 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 blah. But in this case, I'm going to make an exception because wonder has been part of the human imagination for as long as we've been recording stories. So we go right back to Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a wonder tale. So many of the stories that we have told ourselves to make sense of the world around us, to entertain each other, to educate children, all of those kinds of things, jokes, are based on sort of the surprise of wonder. And I don't think that a lot of things are innate to humans. I think that a lot of things, I tend to move over to the nurture side of the nature-nurture argument a lot of the time, but I think that the capacity for wonder is something that is innately human and that gives a feeling of exploration, of possibility, and of hope, which we always need through all of the ages. When we come across a story now in 2024, that has maybe been told for 150, 200 years, there's familiarity, there's comfort in that story, a Little Red Riding Hood story, for example. But we also have the ability to retell that story in any way we want to. Is that girl an innocent little child? Or is she a young woman coming into her sexuality? Or is she something else entirely? Is she a wolf herself? There are ways of coming to these stories that are so well known because they've been shipped around the world that allow us to think about them in different ways and bring different perspectives to them. And all of that is part of wonder, I think.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I like the idea that stories of wonder and imagination give us a sense of hope and possibility, especially in these strange and turbulent times. I think we really need that. And maybe it's a good reminder that people can access stories to help them deal with what's going on in the world right now.
I agree. And I think in Just Wonder, that's the book of essays on justice and wonder, we have a few authors talking specifically about activism, so really specific kinds of activism and how wonder comes into that and can be really life-affirming if you're fighting against something that you see as unjust or unjust, and how response to the land on which you live, the people around you, the stories that we tell ourselves or have been told by the media about certain issues, wonder and questioning, as well as, wow, I'm with all of these other people who feel the same way I do, really do offer that kind of hope. And that, I think, is really important. I also think that the escapism of wonder stories shouldn't be forgotten either, and shouldn't be dismissed, and isn't unimportant. I'm all for escapism, right? It can be sort of frothy, wonderful dresses and glittery things and stuff like that, just to take one's mind off of the injustices that we see in the world and to play in a safe place. I think that's really important aspect as well, because it's rejuvenating. It can allow us to come back to ourselves, to reach out to others in joy and fun and just pure elation through the escapism that it has a real value as much as, I don't know, as the more heavy hitting political stuff that I was talking about as well.
That's such a brilliant point. To me, I think play and fun in the imagination is undervalued, and people don't see, they think it is a little bit frivolous. But I think it has a bigger value in society than people realize.
I totally agree. And I think there is a way that in certain sections of our society, we tend to think, oh, well, frivolity, escapism is some kind of privilege. Only people with certain privilege to have the time are allowed to have escapism, and that makes it unimportant or unvaluable. I think that's a completely untrue statement, because whatever kind of difficulty you may be going through, whatever oppression you are living through, one of the ways we get through those kinds of things is through imagination, through escape, to simply be outside of, if it's a really dramatic, terrible situation, or even just life is really hard sometimes. And I just need to see some fairies and somebody getting something, or something, a transformation for somebody else, makes it possible for me to imagine that when I have to get back on that horse and be back in that difficult world that I live in day to day to day. And every single human being has an imagination and has the ability to do that, even if they haven't got access to, movies and streaming services, or can't get to a library because the libraries have been shut down. We can and do tell ourselves and tell others oral stories that are fundamental to being who we need to be able to make it from day to day.
Yeah, and that's making me think about the idea of gallows humor. I think comedy arises out of difficulty as well, in a very strange way. It's like weird weeds growing out of the muck.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think there's a role in Wonder Tales for comedy and humor that makes them really engaging. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And even that dark humor, I think, famously, Guillermo del Toro, the film director of Pan's Labyrinth, Shape of Water, has said that he sees fairy tales and horror, I think I'm quoting him correctly, as two sides of the same coin, or maybe as siblings. Anyway, as very closely related, fairy tales and horror. And I completely agree with him. Coming up through loving horror so much and then moving over to fairy tales, in a way, they are very much intertwined, because so many fairy tale texts have utter horror at their center. The abuses of the princesses, or the starvation of the children, or the witches eating the children, or whatever it is. Fairy tales have what I think of as disruptive middles rather than just the happy ending. Personally, I'm not all that interested in happy endings. That just, the happily ever after is like, oh, whatever. That's just how you stop the story. But the really gritty stuff, the really interesting stuff, is those disruptive middles where the world is upside down. You don't know what's happened or where things are going to go. And often those disruptive middles are connected to horror and fear and even sort of comedy, that gallows humor, that dark humor in a talking wolf wearing a grandmother's outfit trying to eat a child. That's kind of funny.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point, especially for writers, because so many writers struggle with the middle of their books or stories. They call it the messy middle. But if we flip that and call it the disruptive middle, that invites a lot more play and challenge. It feels really juicy to me. I'm really interested in the disruptive middle.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, I think it's really helped me in my writing when I work with fiction to think about, how am I going to disrupt this world in a way that's interesting and put these characters in a place that they haven't been in before and they have to figure out. And I have to figure out as a writer, as it comes to it, I really like disrupting stuff. That's who I am as a person.
Yeah, there's definitely fun in disruption.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's all interconnected with the concepts of play and justice all at the same time.
Exactly. I think many of us think of these as discrete things, that thinking about justice somehow has to be very serious and very sort of po-faced and, well-intentions, and we must, be careful and blah, 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 blah. And you never get to justice through being autocratic or not allowing for joy, not allowing for mistakes, not allowing for mess or the messy middle. That there has to be humor. There has to be a recognition of darkness on the way to light, because if you can't see it, you can't fix it. But you also can't just dwell in it for too terribly long. And it's the hope and the wonder that is going to let you find that rope to pull you out of those darker places in your writing. Or, if you're an activist person, or if you're a person who's interested in taking part in the political world, having humor, having hope, having joy, and play, as you say, are all absolutely integral, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how tales of wonder and fairy tales hold mirrors up to society. They reflect society. They also exaggerate things a lot. But I'm also wondering what else they tell us about society that maybe we haven't talked about yet.
I think that they tell us a lot of different things. They are products of the time in which they're created. So while every single person, I'm going to use Red Riding Hood again because that's a particular favorite of mine. Well, you can pretty confidently say the vast majority of people know the story of Red Riding Hood in its bare bones. A little girl is going to her grandmother's through the forest. She meets a wolf, tells the wolf where she's going. The wolf gets there first, eats up the grandmother or stuffs grandmother in a closet, depending on what generation you are. The girl arrives, the wolf is in Granny's clothes and tries to trick her. And then she either escapes from having a nice man come and save her, or she is clever enough to save herself. And, that's the end of that story. The thing that's really interesting about that story is that it allows, and other stories as well, that bare bones story can be told in so many different ways. And it can tell us so many different things about the world. It can talk about gender relations. It can talk about our relationships to the natural world, to other humans and non-human animals. We can look at it as a story about age and the ways that our culture thinks about age and aging and what is of value and what is not of value. It could be just a straight up erotic pornographic tale, if you want to tell it that way. It can be a comedy of, a farce of, one character running into the room and another character running out of the room and somebody being in a closet and somebody under the bed. We can tell them in all of those different ways and tell ourselves the stories about our world through something that simple. So that we've always got this sort of possibility of repetition with variation, with folk tales in particular. Again, as I think I mentioned before, because these tales are not authored, and even Walt Disney can't copyright them and tell you you can't tell the Snow White tale or you can't tell Beauty and the Beast, anyone can take these stories and tell them in the way they need to get to some kind of belief or authentic truth to that author. And I think that's going to be one of the things that makes them so enduring, is that they're really, really flexible. Early scholars thinking about fairy tales talked about them as being relatively flat, that they're generally short narratives with flat characters who are open to, whatever we'd like to do with them. And their plot lines are pretty straightforward. They're relatively linear. So we've got that structure there for us. And we can bring, as writers, whatever we need to bring to them to talk about the issues that we want to talk about. And I think very many fairy tales are relatable to those of us raised in sort of Western culture, for sure.
Yeah, there's something really interesting about the telling and retelling of fairy tales, that they kind of grow and shift and change as society does and culture does. Mm-hmm. But there's also a liberating, empowering sense to that as well, because as a writer, if you're retelling a fairy tale or tale of wonder, you can kind of shape it the way you want to and bring your perspective to it. And really, it's like this cool ability to shapeshift the characters and the narrative.
Exactly.
So,
right.
Yeah.
We often think of fairy tales as being transformative, right? That there's something transformative within the tales themselves, but they're also really malleable so that we can transform them as well, as you're saying.
Yeah. And thinking back to when I teach writers, I'm always so amazed that I'm teaching a class of 20 students and I give them an assignment. Nobody ever does the same thing. Nobody's ever telling the same story the same way. Everybody has their own exceptionally, like not just a little bit unique, but like exceptionally unique way of seeing things. So
isn't that just amazing too? I mean, as a writer who has, taken courses and had someone give me a prompt that they've given to, maybe 15 or 20 other people, I start writing my thing and I think, oh, this is so derivative. Everyone else is saying the exact same thing. It's just a repeat of what everybody else is doing. And then, as you say, you find out what other people in the class are doing and you're like, wow, I could never have thought of approaching it this way, but that's amazing. And if you're able to be in a collaborative relationship, I love collaborative writing. It can be tricky, but I love it because how much one can play off another person. And I get so excited about ideas that another person has that I can go, oh my God. And then we could do this. And then what do you think? Oh, is that really stupid? What do you think? Can you fix that hole? Having that collaborative relationship can be so exciting, I think. And also sometimes you don't have to write the stuff that you don't want to write.
Yeah, collaboration is like really fun in terms of writing. We often think of writing as a lonely, solitary thing, but it can be really collaborative. Mm-hmm. Is that why you are a co-editor on these two books? That you love the collaborative aspect of writing and producing books?
It's definitely the thing that I really love doing, the co-editing, particularly because I'm so fortunate in my partners, in Christina Baculega and Pauline Greenhill, that they are, really well-established scholars, both of them. They really know their stuff. They really know where they're going with their stuff. And they're encouraging and really take what I'm saying, even if what I'm saying is kind of wacky and out there, which sometimes it is, they're both very open to sort of listening to, okay, what's Jennifer going on about now? And it's like, oh, okay, this is interesting. Maybe we can go in this direction. And having that openness and willingness to collaborate without competition is, to me, really, really just, it sort of feeds my soul. And as an editor, I haven't talked about any of the contributors to either of our books, the scholars and the artists who contributed to our books. They also are collaborators, perhaps not as in-depth as the editor relationship is, because we are making the decisions of what essays are coming in here, or which stories are we going to choose, and why are we going to choose them, and in what order are we going to place them in the text in relation to each other, and what are we going to sort of try to point people towards. But absolutely, those writers and artists are collaborators as well, in one way or another, whether we're having direct feedback on their pieces like we did in the essays. We could say, oh, well, can you answer this question that we have, or can you expand on this idea? In the Inviting Interruptions book, which was a book of previously published work, we obviously didn't have that kind of editorial talk back and forth with the authors and artists we worked with. We were just saying, hey, we're doing this thing. Would you be willing to allow us to include your piece within it? We make no changes other than placing it in arrangement, in conjunction or relationship to other texts that it's maybe never talked to before. And I just really love working with other people. I think writing can feel so lonely, and it can feel like you're just doing it all on your own, in your own head, and you're pulling your hair out. But being able to talk to someone else who's working on the same project, who's inside the same project, can be really comforting. It can allow you to have better judgment about your own work. I can be really, really hard on my work. Like, that's just the worst sentence in the world. I'm going to spend another 3 weeks writing that sentence. Well, that's not what I'm thinking, but kind of is. And you have someone else come along and say, no, that sentence is fine, but get to the next thing. What is it leading to? Or they might say, you don't even need that sentence at all. Or how about if we just twig these 2 words? And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm free. I can move on, rather than being stuck in my own head.
Exactly. Yeah. Makes it a little bit calmer and more fun.
Yeah, it works well for me, I think. And I hope that my collaborators feel the same.
One thing that I'm curious about is the relationship, in particular in folklore, to our natural world and ecology in Wonder Tales. Do you think that the experience of living in Hawaii helped you think about that a little bit more closely?
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of it that way. I grew up in Toronto, in Scarborough, a suburb of Toronto, and had my summers out in BC as a child, right up until my whatever age it was when I went off to Hawaii for grad school. And I had never thought of going to somewhere like Hawaii. Most of my friends thought I would end up somewhere gray and dark, like Ireland or Scotland or something. But Christina was in Hawaii, so to Hawaii I went. And there was a lot I had to learn about moving to a place that was basically stolen. It was annexed by the American government, that the Indigenous people had been treated as badly as the Indigenous people of Canada that I knew something about, though not nearly enough as a settler Canadian, or a settler living in Canada. So there was a lot of politics I had to learn about the very, to me, Oahu, compared to Ontario, Oahu is quite a small geographic space. So people live a lot sort of closer together, and you can see the disparity in wealth and lack of wealth much more visually. That was surprising to me. Moving to a place that was not what I expected it to. I didn't really know what to expect when I went. So learning to be respectful of the land that was so different from the land that I grew up in. Having the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, around me at all times was incredible. It really made me think of myself in a different place in the world. And I also thought a lot more about, what right do I have to be here? Everyone I met was incredibly welcoming, incredibly kind. My friends who are Hawaiian, as opposed to friends who live in Hawaii, who live, in the state of Hawaii, were all very welcoming and kind, and put up with whatever stupidity I came up with from being a Canadian, moving into that space, and my curiosity and my questions. But I had to wonder, is this really a place that I belong? What am I bringing to this place? Or am I just taking? And after a while, for me, I didn't feel like I was contributing enough to Hawaii, to the sovereignty movement, to a lot of things. And I think at the same time, I was feeling a bit homesick. I really missed Canada. I missed my land. I think of this as my land, although I am a settler. Ontario is a place I have a deep connection to. And, the forests and the hills and the land here, the lakes, the Canadian Shield, I feel that in my bones, where I always felt a visitor in Hawaii. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. It definitely, I think the thing that happened for me most moving to Hawaii was my relationship and my understanding of myself as a political person, and that I could no longer just go along la-di-da in, my settler headspace of, my white settler headspace of, everything's fine. I'm a nice person. Therefore, I'm not contributing to oppression of other people. I'd been political in university before, but, York University's politics for a white settler at the time I was there were relatively easy to be liberal, In Hawaii, it was more of a challenge. I had to ask myself questions that I hadn't had to ask before. And I am forever grateful for that. It's not comfortable. At times I felt like a real, let me say, jerk or interloper, which I definitely didn't want to feel. But it's also, I hope, and I think, made me a better scholar, a better writer. I hope maybe a better person, and a little bit more mature and aware that the world is even more wondrous and wonderful, and the people in it are more diverse than I ever could have imagined if I had just stayed, living in Canada and, going to Europe every few years. I'm not sure if that really addresses your question.
That makes total sense to me. And I love that you highlighted the fact that growth is never comfortable.
Yeah.
Growth is never comfortable.
Yeah.
But it's important to our lives that it also, that discomfort also makes a good story.
That's a good way to look at it. I'm not sure if I told that story terribly well just now, but it is something that occasionally I think, I need to sit down and write this, my position and my discomforts, and not try to make myself feel more comfortable with my experiences, and recognize my responsibilities and the choices that I've made. And I think I'm very, very glad I came back to Canada, and I will always be just so deeply grateful for my time in Hawaii and how much I learned and how much I continue to love that land as a guest, always as a guest.
Sounds like a really good example of what we were talking about earlier with the disruptive middles.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to take that concept of disruptive middles and run with it.
Please do.
It's a really good one. It's a really good one. I'm going to keep that. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we haven't discussed today?
I think we've touched upon a lot of the things that I wanted to touch upon. Yeah, I think I'm feeling pretty comfortable with what we chatted about. Were there other things that you wanted to talk about?
I think we covered a lot of really interesting concepts for people to think about. Did you have an inspiring quote or idea or writing prompt that you wanted to leave?
Well, I used to teach a lot at the university level, so the writing prompt came pretty easily. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you want, so do tell me if you were hoping for something different.
I'm sure it's great.
But here is my writing prompt, and I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up. So for the writers listening, sometime in your writing life, in the next couple of weeks perhaps, take one object from your life, and it might be a precious heirloom, or it might be a present that you or someone else gave you, or it might be an everyday object like your oven or a garden tool, just any old thing. Now, try to find the wonder within that, or inject some wonder into it. That is, explore the ways that wonder adheres to or comes from your object during your writing time this week. I would suggest maybe providing a description, maybe write about the object's function or meaning to you, or you might create a whole new life for that object that you never knew about before. And if you really get into it, who knows, you might even want to send the object on an adventure. And I do have a little caveat, a sort of extra challenge, if I may. For an added challenge, if you normally write realist fiction or nonfiction, maybe try to put some magic or the marvelous into that object. Go as wild or as subtle as you want, but try to push out of your comfort zone a little bit by playing with the magic, with the unreal. Similarly, if you normally write in speculative fiction or fantasy, sci-fi, working with wonder a lot, maybe try to look at your object and find a non-magical source of wonder for or within the object. So for my oven example a minute ago, we can look at that through wonder because it is a transformation machine, right? It takes ingredients, add heats, and then makes them into yummy goodness, or a yucky mess if you're me, right? There may be ways of trying to challenge yourself to move away from metaphoric magic into trying to find real world wonder in something around you. How's that?
Wow, that's so beautiful. I can't wait to I'm going to try that prompt myself. See what happens. But it's
okay, I hope it's helpful.
It's a beautiful prompt.
I've done this myself a few times when I've been totally stuck or really just, I don't know what to do. You know, I haven't got a project that I'm liking right now. I don't know what to do. And the first time it happened, I was complaining and we were in my partner's father's house. And I was like, you know, I got to do something. I've got to create something. I have no ideas. I've got nothing. And he just sort of looked around. He's like, write about the organ. And walked out of the room. And just that, you know, gave me this whole story that sort of just came really quickly from that. So that's where that comes from.
That's so awesome. I can't wait to try it. Thank you so much for that. How do people find you online, and where do they find your books?
The books are available, Just Wonder, Shifting Perspectives in Tradition, is available from University of Colorado Press in the US or UBC Press in Canada. And of course, you can buy it from the big bad Amazon store as well. Inviting Interruptions, Wonder Tales in the 21st Century is from the Wayne State University Press in the US. Unfortunately, they don't have a Canadian distributor. So either you need to go to the Wayne State University Press website where you can get it, or you kind of need to get it from the big bad Amazon. Okay. As for me, I use social media almost exclusively to look at pictures of cats. I don't really post a lot. My Instagram is pretty much all cats all the time. But if you have any questions or want to get in touch with me for any reason, you can send me an email to niffero@gmail.com. That's niffero@gmail.com. And I will try to get back to you as quickly as I can.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your beautiful time. And I just love this discussion. I found it really inspiring, and I hope other writers will find it inspiring too. It just made me think about things in a different light, a different perspective, and it gave me a lot of hope at this challenging time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suzanne. This was so much fun. I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about these kinds of things. I work from home a lot and I don't see a lot of other people. So having a chance to chat about wonder always makes me excited and happy. I hope people find it useful.
Well, that's wonderful. Thanks again.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're getting the Stardust and Courage newsletter. Sign up by visiting my site at suzanneandrew.com. Be sure to tell your friends about this podcast too. I hope this episode gives you a glimmer of hope in the power of storytelling in a difficult time in the world. If you're listening in real time, happy holidays. Stardust and Courage is now on a short break and returns for season 2 in the new year. Sending you Stardust and Courage until next time.